What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my least favorite boss fights. As someone who plays and reviews a lot of games, needless to say, I have defeated many a boss. However, some of them I found particularly underwhelming. In some cases, I would not consider these bosses to be bad in any way, so much as just disappointing or boss fights that I personally just didn't enjoy very much. In 1 or 2 cases, I would argue they are probably just also bad, but nonetheless, today I wanted to talk about some of my least favorites across the hundreds of games that I've played and reviewed at this point. So with that out of the way, let's actually dive into this a little bit. So first up on the list, we have the Kraken from Divinity Original Sin 2. If you've been around the channel for a long time, you might have heard me complain about this guy before, back when I covered a lot of the Divinity series. The Kraken is one of the bosses in the last act of the game, though is far from being the final one by any means. But nonetheless, if I had to point to any one boss in that game that was my least favorite, the Kraken wins every single time. Now, in this particular case, I would not say this boss is bad, so much as the way I like to play the game kind of directly conflicts with this boss, down to things like the builds I enjoy using and how I go about approaching it. So because of this, the party composition and team that I like to use is in many ways sort of hard countered by this guy, which is down to a lot of freeze effects from all its various tentacles, and ultimately this guy winds up leaving me with a few choices, either respecking my party for this one fight, basically, which is possible in Original Sin 2, it's tedious, but very much so possible, or sort of brute forcing my way through it using a variety of other mechanics to cheese the fight a little bit, which is usually what I wind up doing, which involves the creative use of terrain and simply making use of the fact that the Kraken is forced to be stationary in the harbor that you fight it at, which allows you to pull back and regroup as necessary, or to better position yourself against its tentacles, which are rather spread out otherwise. But all of that together makes for a boss that I have just never enjoyed fighting, and it's easily my least favorite in that entire game. But we've still got 4 more to go, so for our next entry, we are talking the final boss fight for Risen 1 against the Fire Titan. The problem with this boss is basically everything about it. This is one on the list that I would just consider to be a bad boss, as you don't so much fight the Fire Titan as you do perform a series of platforming events that comprise the fight. Basically, you move around a circular platform, deflect some things, and occasionally hit the guy. And it's just such an incredibly underwhelming fight to cap off an otherwise really great game, to the point of it being almost shockingly bad. Now, with RPGs, final bosses tend to be hit or miss, and I don't necessarily need those bosses to be some incredibly difficult uphill challenge, but I do think they need to provide a satisfactory conclusion to your story. And in the case of Risen 1, it fails at doing both of those things. This weird sort of platforming boss fight is present nowhere else in the game, has almost nothing to do with the skills you've been building and acquiring up to that point, and as a result, it fails to provide that satisfying conclusion to the story at the same time. So in the case of this particular boss, while it is certainly one of my least favorites, I would go so far as to say it's one of the worst bosses I've ever fought, but nonetheless, we're not done yet, because that brings us to our third entry with Elden Ring's The Elden Beast, the final boss of that game. Now, with a game like Elden Ring, there's a variety of boss fights and people are going to feel different ways about each of them individually, and while there are plenty of bosses in that game I'm not terribly fond of, I don't think the Elden Beast in particular is a great boss, which I think comes down to, I would say, 2 primary things. For starters, it's actually a second boss right after having just defeated a previous boss. You get thrown into the Elden Beast fight, which means if you die on the second fight, you have to kill that first boss, Radagon, over and over again until you defeat the Elden Beast as well, which is already annoying by itself, especially in a game like Elden Ring where, you're probably going to die a few times. But then, in addition to that, the Elden Beast, unlike a lot of other bosses, is almost constantly trying to just get away from you. It has some big sweeping AoEs that you need to avoid, but once you get the feel for it, it's not that bad. The problem here is that you spend more of this fight running after the Elden Beast than you do fighting the Elden Beast, which is just an incredibly boring conclusion to an otherwise pretty great game. Personally, I would have preferred they just threw a second phase onto Radagon and given him some much more amped up attacks, as I think that would have been more interesting than this weird shift with the Elden Beast that just doesn't feel that great. But luckily, after this guy's down, the credits roll and you get to bask in the glory of having defeated Elden Ring. Which brings us, however, to our fourth entry with the Dark Elf boss from the original God of War reboot. And this particular boss is one of my least favorites purely because of the erratic nature of this enemy type. And this boss, of course being a boss version of that enemy type, takes that to an extreme. And because they have a tendency to flit around the screen and move around in somewhat hard to follow ways, it's just not an enemy I could personally ever get a bead on. And while the normal versions of this enemy, even on the hardest difficulty, can be dealt with quickly enough that it's just not a big deal, the boss version of this guy has so much health and an attack pattern that has to be sort of addressed, I just never really could get the hang of it. And on God of War difficulty, I had to resort to cheese to beat this guy, using the runic or sort of special attacks that you can get. I would spam those, run across to the other side of the room of the very large arena you're in so they could recharge, and it takes the boss a while to actually traverse that distance. So by the time he gets to you, they're all charged up again, so you can spam them, then run across. And I basically just rinsed and repeated that until he was finally dead, because I simply could not deal with this guy's attack pattern, which made this random boss one of the most difficult in that game for me, which I think is honestly pretty funny considering I would not think of this guy even as a major boss of that game really, but I struggled with him much more than any other boss in that game. So needless to say, wasn't a fan. That, however, does bring us to our final entry with Lu Bu from Wolong Fallen Dynasty, a relatively recent game. And while a game like this is known for its difficulty, much like the Souls-like series, I think Lu Bu is not what I would consider the hardest boss in that game, though he is certainly considered that by a lot of people. The reason I don't like this guy is simply his boss fight is very mechanical in nature, and you don't get a lot of opportunities to attack the guy. And because of this, the boss fight becomes incredibly long and more a battle of attrition than it is directly fighting. Lu Bu has a lot of mechanics you have to account for. He's constantly shooting arrows at you from horseback, attacking you left and right. Because he's on horseback, he likes to run around you, which can cause the camera to spin a lot or lose the lock on the guy. And ultimately, you have to deflect all these attacks, parry his big wind-ups to eventually get him off the horse, where he will then switch to large sort of 360-degree AoEs that you have to flit in between to get attacks in, before he gets back on his horse and you have to do it all over again. And while it's certainly not impossible, obviously, it's just an incredibly long, tedious fight, and it's structured in a way where a lot of your normal abilities probably aren't going to cut it here, because it's more of a marathon than a sprint, which for me, it just wasn't my cup of tea, honestly. And while, again, I wouldn't consider him the hardest boss of the game by any means, it certainly was my least favorite. But that is going to cut it for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. There have been 5 bosses that were my least favorite. I'd love to hear about some bosses you either really enjoyed in various video games, as there are plenty of those as well, or some other bosses you might be thinking of that were equally a poor time. But either way, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.